Hi there. This post kicks off a 3-video series on what Jungian analyst James Hollis refers to as the 3 A's of adulthood, the first of which is anxiety. Now, people sometimes ask me who my favorite author in the psychological field is, and the name that always comes to mind is James Hollis, which is a bit weird because I'm a cognitive behavior therapist and he's a Jungian analyst, and you would think the twain would never meet. But all of us engaged in helping people manage the problems of human life are essentially looking at the same mountain, often from different angles. And it can be very helpful to see the perspective of someone looking at it from an angle that's not your own. Hollis is the author of many books, including a brilliant book on midlife called The Middle Passage, one on intimate relationships called The Eden Project, and one on the positive aspects of uncomfortable emotional states called Swamplands of the Soul. I recommend them all. One of his primary interests is on the psychology of life after midlife, which he calls, not surprisingly, the second half of life, hence his book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. Hollis does a lot of teaching, and for many years he came regularly to Vancouver to provide talks and workshops under the auspices of the C.G. Jung Society of Vancouver. It was at one of these presentations that he talked about the 3 A's of, in effect, maturity, and they resonated with me a great deal. Now, please do not take this video as a description of James Hollis's thinking. It isn't. He is perfectly capable of speaking for himself, and he does so eloquently in his books and lectures. Go to the source. What I'll mention is my own take on the 3 elements or aspects of life that he addresses. I think the reason that Hollis's 3 A's struck me is that they're slightly contrarian. As the author of How to Be Miserable, I tend to like that. One of my own concerns is how popular psychology and popular ideas about mental health may actually be detrimental to individuals and to a culture. And much of the popular discourse around mental wellness, as we've started to call it, goes in exactly the opposite direction to the 3 A's, which are anxiety, ambivalence, and ambiguity. Hollis's argument, which, again, you should get from him directly, is that an essential task of maturity is to come to terms with and, in effect, welcome or at least accept these normal aspects of life. So let's start with anxiety. For me, one of the troubling things about the way mental health gets presented is that anxiety and anxiety disorders are talked about in the same breath. I'm constantly reading things like, gosh, 20% of adults are experiencing anxiety, or 40% of children have anxiety, and so we have a mental health crisis. Well, for one thing, this is hugely optimistic. It suggests that somewhere there are people who don't experience anxiety. And, well, it's true, there are. Who are they? The dead ones. If you have a pulse, though, you're going to experience a certain amount of anxiety. Why? Because it's a normal element of life. It's a standard part of the emotional equipment that we were all born with. If you experience anxiety, this in itself is normal. It's expected, and it's not going to change. You're not going to wake up one day and not feel anxiety anymore. You will not feel anxiety anymore on the day that you don't wake up. So what do we do with it? We get confused between anxiety and anxiety disorders. When public mental health education campaigns talk about a certain percentage of children having anxiety, what they mean is anxiety to an enormous degree, to the exclusion of many other emotions, to the extent that we might call it a disorder. Now, most of these estimates are not based on actual in-depth psychological assessments of a randomly selected group of kids or adults. They tend to be based on brief telephone or online interviews or questionnaires or surveys, which are great ways to get an exaggerated sense of how prevalent a problem is. So we do mental health education about facts that we don't actually have. In fact, very few well-constructed studies show a prevalence of anxiety disorder that's anywhere near the levels that are often talked about in public mental health awareness campaigns. These campaigns are well-intentioned, but more often than not, they're simply promoting misinformation. People who pay attention to the messages they give are more likely to believe things that simply are not true. We would be better off without them. If you don't know anything about mental health, that's probably better than being convinced you do know some things that are not true. A blank slate is better than one covered in errors. But a deeper issue is this equation of anxiety with anxiety disorder. Now, obviously, we know what's going on here. It's a kind of shorthand, right? We say anxiety. What we mean is anxiety disorder, a completely different thing, vastly more extreme, disabling, and in effect, a sign of a real problem. But what we say is anxiety, and inevitably, anxiety gets seen as a problem that needs to be solved. Now, this is an issue even for people who truly do have what we might consider anxiety disorders. Most of these disorders have two elements: anxiety and avoidance. If I'm socially anxious, for example, then I experience this uncomfortable emotion when I'm around people, and I probably tend to try to reduce that anxiety by avoiding those situations. The avoidance becomes habitual, and it reinforces the sense that those situations are dangerous, even though they're not. This means that the anxiety gets even more intense with time and is more easily triggered by milder and milder social encounters. So if we have an anxiety problem, whether or not it's severe enough to be considered a disorder, it almost always comes with experiential avoidance. And that begs the question. Actually, two questions, but they both have the same answer. First, which is the bigger problem, the anxiety or the avoidance? And second, where should we focus our efforts, the anxiety or the avoidance? Most effective treatment strategies for extreme anxiety target the avoidance, not the anxiety. The anxiety is produced in large part by the avoidance. If we overcome the avoidance bit by bit, the anxiety tends to fade. Not to zero, but it fades. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's the central reality. So was James Hollis talking about how to treat anxiety disorders? No, not really. He was talking about how to approach life and cope with its challenges. And his point, which he may well feel that I'm mangling, was that anxiety is an essential aspect of what it is to be human. You can spend your entire existence trying to minimize anxiety or extinguish your ability to feel it, but you will fail, and you will create a smaller and narrower existence in the process. Our culture is really oriented toward the management of anxiety. Relaxation classes, breathing strategies, yoga, forest bathing, calming apps on your phone, anti-anxiety medications. There's been a lot of emphasis lately on mindfulness meditation. And it's interesting how much of that discussion is around anxiety management, as though the whole point of meditation and mindfulness, which are two separate things, by the way, is to stamp out anxiety. And newsflash, it's not. The ability to recognize how we increase our own suffering is a part of mindfulness practice, but only a part. Selling it as a kind of stress reduction technique does it a disservice. It dumbs down a whole set of practices that have many functions beyond just keeping you chilled out. We've really bought into the idea that anxiety is something we need to spend a lot of time getting rid of, that it's a toxic risk to our lives. And the truth is, it's not that comfortable. And all of those things that I've mentioned can be useful as ways of accommodating to the natural anxiety that we will all experience. But the point is not to stamp out anxiety. It's to increase our tolerance for it, to allow it to be present and not disable us or make us spend our lives running for safety whenever it appears. A bigger life is almost always in the direction of our anxiety, not in the direction of our calm. Coming to terms with the reality and inevitability of anxiety is one of the central missions of life. Our culture implies that maturity and wisdom mean overcoming your anxiety. This is not the case. Your anxiety cannot be overcome, and your attempts to overcome it will tend, in the long run, only to make it more intense. The direction of growth is to expand our willingness to feel anxiety and not be controlled by it, not obey it when it tells us to run away and hide, and not waste our lives trying to eliminate it. Okay, so that's one of the 3 A's. There are 2 others, and I'll talk about them in upcoming posts. Thanks for watching. My books, How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies You Already Use, and How to Be Miserable in Your 20s, are available through all major booksellers.